What's going on, guys? Welcome back to WWE Network and Show, where I, Graham G.S. Matthews, break down all the original content I watch on the WWE Network, on Peacock, and on Vice, as today we're talking the 9 Lives of Vince McMahon documentary. Now, this came out about a week ago, for when we're speaking right now, on Tuesday, December 13th. This was originally supposed to air on Vice TV back in October, and then days before, less than a week before it was supposed to air, they bumped it. And we found out a few weeks ago they saved it until after the finale of Tales from the Territory. I think that Tuesday that they were supposed to air it was like a big episode of NXT right before Halloween Havoc, I think. They had that Tuesday Night Dynamite as well. That was a big show. That was like the 1 week of the year where fucking Dynamite airs on a Tuesday due to the NBA or whatever, so they were on Tuesday that week. They still had Tales from the Territories on to that point, so there was a lot going on. They were smart to save it for December. I mean, there's a lot of issues with this documentary that we'll get into in a moment, but one of the biggest problems was that there still isn't enough out there to really justify. I still think it's too soon for a documentary on Vince. Now, I know all the allegations and stuff, the news broke on him leaving WWE, and the allegations first broke via the Wall Street Journal back in June. It's been 6 months, but at the same time, though, stuff is still coming out. I mean, literally, the day that this documentary aired, that Tuesday, during the day, we found out via the Wall Street Journal that Vince, more allegations are out. A new allegation, it was an update, I think, on the Rita Chatterton. I'm not sure how you pronounce her last name. The Rita, allegation from the limo incident and the rape that we'll get into as we speak about this documentary in a moment. There was updates on that, and it also was included in the doc that he's planning a comeback to the company. Now, do I think that's actually going to happen, as I've said elsewhere before? I don't think so, but still, that's a pretty big update on the Vince McMahon scandal since he's been, not even relatively, he's been completely quiet since he left WWE back in July. We have not heard from him at all. We've seen him in public maybe once or twice, being photographed in New York City out at parties and stuff. Beyond that, we really have not heard or seen Vince at all since the news broke that he was out of WWE, that he was retiring back in July. So, the timing on that was terrible because obviously they could have included that here, got more mileage out of the documentary. This was 2 hours long. It was 2 hours long, and it still could have been, a Vince McMahon documentary you can't do in an hour. The problem with this doc specifically, because it was produced by Vice, literally 85 to 90% of this thing was fucking Dark Side of the Ring clips. And I love Dark Side of the Ring. I've watched all 3 seasons. We broke down every episode here on the channel. I love the show. But I remember all those episodes. They weren't from 5-10 years ago. They were only from, 3, 4, even a year ago. Some of these episodes were only from a year ago. The fucking steroid trial, that was the season finale for season 3, came out little over a year ago. It's still fresh in the mind. Now, they didn't go into great detail with every incident, but they included a lot of clips and a lot of old footage from those Dark Side of the Ring episodes. Whether it was the Snuka episode, whether it was the steroid trials, Benoit/Eddie, the plane ride from hell, and many, many others. So that was disappointing. We did get some new talking head footage from Vince Russo, who's a fucking clown with a lot of the shit that he says. So getting him isn't exactly a coup, but they got Vince Russo for this thing, Brian Alvarez, Meltzer, Brian Solomon, who's a wrestling historian and writer, I believe, and maybe one. I think they had the guy that is in charge of WrestleNomics as well. His name's escaping me. Oh, Brandon Thurston, who's very good at what he does. They had some, comments from him. Beyond that sort of stuff, though, there really was nothing new in this documentary. A lot of this, if you have followed Vince's career as a wrestling fan, you will learn absolutely nothing new from this doc. The early upbringing of Vince was interesting. I knew most of it, maybe not everything about the military academy stuff. That was only covered in the first 7 minutes of the doc. And then the allegations and stuff that came out about him, that wasn't talked about in previous Dark Side of the Ring episodes. Obviously, they haven't done an episode on Vince before. The Rita stuff from 2006 and then other incidents, but they covered that so quickly. And again, it wasn't really new info. If you have followed the Vince saga, specifically in the last 6 months, a lot of what they talked about was not new information. They flat out say out of the gate that Vince was... They asked him to be, involved in the project. He said no. He declined to participate, and that was it. They put it in there twice, at the beginning and at the halfway point around the hour-long mark or whatever. At the 1 hour mark, they included those comments as well that he declined to participate in this documentary, which, no shit, but at least they tried, I guess. Beyond that sort of stuff, though, this really was nothing new. Now, that being said, For someone that's not knowledgeable about the Vince McMahon story and the 9 lives of Vince McMahon, as they called it, and his various scandals and issues and stuff, that hasn't seen Dark Side of the Ring, that didn't follow that show, that didn't follow those 3 seasons, I would recommend this. I did think it was interesting from that standpoint. For example, I think I've shown my dad maybe one episode of Dark Side of the Ring on the Benoit one from years ago, from the 2nd season. I would show him this. I would send him the link to this. It's a 2-hour doc, probably closer to an hour and a half without commercials. And he can kind of catch up on everything that he probably did not know about Vince, aside from the recent scandals and the allegations and stuff. For someone like that, a complete casual viewer, this would be good watching material, good material to check out to learn more about his story. But for, again, like I said, anyone who has watched Dark Side of the Ring or really knows anything about Vince, you're not really learning anything new from this thing. It was interesting. I'm glad I watched it. It was well put together, but the recycling of the clips left me disappointed from Dark Side of the Ring. And again, it also makes me wonder I assume the documentary is catered to the casuals, because why else would you include as many Dark Side of the Ring clips as they did? But that being said, it's airing on the same network that Dark Side of the Ring did. If you're catering to that hardcore wrestling audience that watched Dark Side of the Ring, they're not going to be too happy with this. This kind of, even from the get-go, from the moment it was announced, I didn't figure it would be anything massive. But if you're going to put out a doc on Vince, they covered all their bases for the most part, like the major allegations, and again, his upbringing and breaking into the business and taking over the territories. They did cover all the facts for the most part. Some stuff was a bit of a stretch. As far as new information presented from new perspectives from different people, yeah, we got the perspective of, again, Alvarez and Meltzer and Solomon and Thurston. Cool, but I hear their opinions on this stuff every week on their various podcasts. So from that standpoint, this was kind of a waste of time, but let's get into it. You can hear my full review here as we get started. So they talk about how he grew up in a North Carolina trailer park, lived with his mom, alluded in a 2001 Playboy interview, actually, when Playboy also did just interviews and not just pictures and stuff, that he was sexually assaulted by his mother. Now, I don't think he outright just said it, but it was heavily implied based on the comments. They include the comments in the article in this documentary. They also mentioned that his stepfather was a very abusive man. It wasn't until he was 12. Now, this I did not know, and again, it's public knowledge. I just didn't know. It wasn't until he was 12 that he met his biological father, Vince Sr. They talk about how he hung out with Jerry Graham and all this other sort of stuff, who was like a very over-the-top sort of guy. That's probably where he, had that chaotic lifestyle and where he was inspired by that and whatever, because Jerry Graham was just a fucking madman, I guess. So Vince got in trouble a lot as a teen and got sent to military school by his father, by his mother, whatever. And I guess he claims to be the only student there to be court-martialed. His mom was the one who had him arranged to meet Linda. And it was actually because of Vince's mom that he met Linda when I guess she was 13. In the comments they include from an interview they did many years ago, she makes it sound like, I'm not sure what the age difference is. She says that she was 13. You can do the math. I don't know what the age difference is between the two, but she was 13. She made it sound like he was 16, if not older, which is kind of fucking weird. But anyway, they got married in August of 1966. Vince always wanted to work with his father, Vince Sr., but was turned away every time. But the father did that because he wanted Vince Jr. to have a secure future, not involving wrestling. So Vince went off on his own, did not do well with anything, did not do well or thrive in any area on his own. Didn't have any actual experience with anything, didn't enjoy the stuff that he was trying out. He did start promoting events like boxing stuff and even an Evel Knievel event, but he lost a lot of money off of that. They had to file for bankruptcy, he and Linda did, soon after that. But he always wanted to take WWF to the next level. So he sat down with his father on June 6, 1982, and essentially mortgaged everything he had to buy WWF off of his father. And it was called a balloon mortgage, I guess, from Thurston, which means that you pay a little at first and a lot later. And if you missed the payment, the leadership of WWE would revert back to maybe not Vince Sr., but other people that Vince Sr. would have appointed to be in charge. The big reason for this, and he probably would not have sold the company to his son otherwise, was that Vince Sr. had pancreatic cancer at that point, and he was dying, so he had to do something. Vince Jr., really, unlike his father, wanted to control not just what he already had, but all of wrestling. So he went after the promoters and basically Vince Sr.'s old friends. Vince Sr. caught wind of this from the promoters who were telling Vince Sr., hey, your fucking son's messing everything up. He's putting us out of business. Vince Sr. sat down with his son and said, listen, you can't do that. And Vince Jr. lost his temper at his father and said, listen, I'm in charge now. You work for me. I'm going to do it anyway. Vince Sr. apparently ended up agreeing with him and said, yeah, fuck them. Let's just do what you want to do. So Vince, as the story goes, which is no surprise, this is common knowledge at this point for a lot of fans, Vince Sr. offered to pay a lot of the wrestlers more money they couldn't refuse to come work for him. He bought a lot of the TV time from these local stations to put the territories out of business. He made Hogan his main star, made Hogan an offer he could not refuse, and, inspired by The Godfather, I guess, and he made him champion of the WWF soon after. Now, this was where they got into the recycled footage. First, it was the John Stossel slap heard around the world stuff. Was this a scandal of Vince's? No. He put David Schultz basically up to it. I don't think he told David Schultz to slap John Stossel live on the air, but he basically told him to keep kayfabe. John Stossel worked for 2020 or one of those news stations, I forget which. He wanted to expose wrestling, and he did a hit piece with Eddie Mansfield exposing the business. Vince told David Schultz, who worked for Vince at that point, it was basically one of his top heels back then, to stay in character when Stossel interviewed Schultz. And Schultz's mindset was, when Stossel asked him if it was real, he said wrestling's fake. Schultz thought in his mind, well, my character would slap Stossel, so let me do that. Slapped him twice, one on each side, one in one ear, one in the other. Stossel ended up suing Vince for damages and was paid off for a total sum apparently of $420,000. From there, they transitioned right into the Snuka stuff, where Snuka's girlfriend, Nancy Argentina, was found dead. It was ruled a homicide at the time. Vince, I guess, they talk about it in the episode, which I've gone over before, when he went in to meet with the attorneys and sit down to them in a closed room. First of all, I guess the transcript of what was said at that point was never actually documented, for one. And two, they went in with a briefcase and came out with said briefcase, and Snuka was basically scot-free after that. The case went cold until it was reopened in 2015. Snuka was back, not behind. I don't know if he ever served jail time at that point, but he was under a lot of fire at that point and ended up dying in 2017, so it didn't really matter anyway. WCW, Vince's arch rival, got TV with TBS. Vince wanted that time slot, so he bought their time slot from them in 1984. The audience rejected the product that Vince was putting out of WCW. So Vince ended up selling before, he was freaking out, like, what do I do? The audience isn't buying it. I'm losing money on this. So he sold the promotion to Jim Crockett. Meanwhile, Vince ended up working with a lot of rock stars, including Cyndi Lauper, starts WrestleMania, working with Mr. T. It was a huge gamble. And if it didn't work, if WrestleMania failed, Vince was done in the business. It also helped that they got last-minute promotion with Hogan and Mr. T appearing on SNL the night before, which was not originally planned. I think they were last-minute replacements, and that gave them a big boost in the pay-per-view, box office area, whatever. It did big numbers for them, obviously. So Mania ended up being successful, and it was off to the races from there. They talk about the former referee Rita Chatterson. I forget how you pronounce her last name exactly, if there's an S in there or not. But she accused Vince of raping her in a limo after, I think she was the first and only female referee WWE ever had for a very long time, until they started using female referees in NXT and the Mae Young Classic, and now we have Jess, among other women, on the rosters, which is great. But, they had Rita initially, many, many years ago. And she did a talk show talking about this soon after. They show the footage here on the documentary, that basically she went to meet with Vince in his limo because she felt like she wasn't getting booked enough or paid enough or whatever, went to meet with him, and without going to the minute details of the thing, she was basically forced into oral sex by Vince McMahon, and when it wasn't enough, he basically forced her on top of him and whatever, and he told her basically, this is what you got to do if you want $1 million contract. So she didn't go public with these allegations with what happened until after her parents died, because she didn't want to, freak them out or something like that, I guess. She didn't want to, stress them out, so they passed away. By that point, unfortunately, the statute of limitations ran out. She was sued by Vince for defamation, and that was basically that. And again, more stuff has come out about that, I think, as of last week. I'm not exactly sure what that update was, but that has since been put out there. So anyway, they transitioned from that into the steroid trial stuff and how wrestlers were pressured to do steroids back then in order to look the part. Dr. Zaharian was the one that was the main doctor for WWE. was the one providing said steroids to the performers. The steroids at that point became illegal. He got caught, and that led the government to Vince. In 1991, they went after Vince, and Vince realized he couldn't keep Hogan around in light of all these accusations and whatnot, so Hogan was quietly let go. He went to WCW. Vince wore a neck brace basically for sympathy at the trial. Hogan was brought in to testify against Vince, and he was expected to bury Vince in there, even though he didn't. All he said, basically, was that he took steroids 3 times with Vince in 1983. He essentially exonerated Vince. And he had said, yeah, we had done, not as a drug dealer, we had just been friends, gym buddies, whatever. We had done it together like 10 years ago, but other than that, he never gave it to me, or he never allowed it, or whatever, which obviously is complete bullshit, but whatever. Vince was still furious that Hogan testified against him. Ultimately, Vince was deemed not guilty. Again, it's the summation of the steroid trials episode from last year. And from there, they go into the Montreal Screwjob and how they talk about Bret Hart was made the guy after Hogan left, which isn't exactly accurate. Hogan left in 91, or 93, actually. He was gone in 93. I don't know if the timeline matches up there, but Hogan was gone in like 93. Hart, I guess, kind of became the guy after Hogan left, so I guess that does make sense. I mean, he wasn't the guy, though. They also had Shawn Michaels, among other people. Bret Hart was like one of their main performers at that point. Obviously, just to make it quick here, WCW made Bret Hart an offer, again, that he couldn't refuse, but he ended up agreeing to a new offer with WWE instead because he did not want to leave at that point. Vince realized that the offer that he gave Bret, he couldn't live up to his end of the deal because of the financial state that WWF was in at that point. So Pritchard claims that Bret Hart didn't want to lose the championship, which again I assume is complete bullshit. So they do the Montreal Screwjob. He gets fucked. He spit in Vince's face, did Bret after the match, after losing the championship unknowingly to Shawn Michaels at Survivor Series 1997. Also hit Vince backstage with an uppercut. And Vince went on TV soon after and said that Bret screwed Bret, and from that became an on-air villain and the greatest heel in WWE history. So from there he kept running into scandals, did Vince. WCW took advantage of that, among many other reasons. It wasn't just the fact that Vince had his eyes off the prize at that point. It was also due to the fact the product just sucked. Bischoff took over, Eric Bischoff that is, took over WCW Creative. WWF lost a lot of its talent. Not all of its talent, but a lot of its talent. WCW had that great mix of a nostalgia effect that Ted Turner was bringing in people like Savage and Flair and Hogan, but at the same time, Bischoff was bringing in talent from Mexico and Japan and international talent that were also ripping it up on the show. So they were having a great product, a hot product for a while. WCW winning the ratings war for about a year and a half, 83 weeks, obviously. From that, the Attitude Era was ushered in by Vince to cater to the teens and young adults, those angsty teens and whatnot. Makes a star to Stone Cold Steve Austin, feuds with him on TV, becomes the hottest feud in all of wrestling. It became must-see TV. Women at that point were also made sex objects. They weren't really wrestlers at that point, not until years later. That was just what Vince saw as making money for them. They also talked quickly about the Austin and Pillman angle. That got a very negative reaction. Vince had to apologize on the air for that. This was pretty far-fetched. He said after like the Stone Cold stuff happened, which was in the late 90s, so it is around the same point. After Bret was gone, he looked from one Hart to another. He looked to Owen Hart. He never saw Owen Hart as a main event star. The closest, Owen Hart was a main event star in terms of talent and everything else. Vince never booked Owen Hart as a main event star after that Bret Hart feud ended in 1994, in late 94. Beyond that, Owen Hart was never really in the main event scene again. So to kind of paint it out like, oh, he was the next guy and then he died is completely fucking dumb. They even talk about how they made him the Blue Blazer. If he was the guy, then why would they make him the Blue Blazer? So they recap the death. I don't really need to get into it again. They talk about the Owen Hart death. JR says that he died, that he had to say on air that he died. The show continued anyway. That was a big controversy, and they should not have continued the show, but they did it fucking anyway. Martha Hart, his wife, ended up suing WWE for wrongful death. Vince then also sued the manufacturer of the quick-release device. Martha ended up settling with WWF with Vince for $18 million. From there, we get into another Dark Side of the Ring episode where they recap the plane ride from hell years later. Vince ended up paying the stewardesses to stay quiet. In 2006, they go over the tanning salon incident, which was thankfully not in any other Dark Side of the Ring episode. So this was new footage, and not new footage, but like new stuff that we hadn't heard talked about on Vice before, where he basically showed naked pictures of himself to the tanning salon attendant, I think in Florida, and he attempted to allegedly lift up her blouse and kiss her. She pushed him away, And when she tried to get local police involved and sue him or whatever, there wasn't enough evidence for a case. And Brian Alvarez speculates maybe there was a payoff. That seems like that was the go-to thing for Vince anyways, we found out years later. So in 2005, Eddie Guerrero dies. His death was exploited on TV in an 2006 angle with Rey Mysterio and Randy Orton on SmackDown, as we all know. Chris Benoit then dies after killing himself and his family, his wife and kid in 2007. They aired the tribute show. More details came out that he was not a good guy and that he fucking killed himself after killing his own family. JR defends the decision in saying, not that they would have done it otherwise, but JR just says, listen, we didn't have all the details. We had a show to run. There was shit coming out. We had to do what we had to do. And the next night on ECW, Vince addressed it and never talked about Benoit again. He was erased from WWE history. Vince was all over the news cycles, having to combat the news coverage, blaming steroids, among other things that Benoit was doing that led to the death of his family. And they talk about here how he passed all the wellness tests miraculously. Maybe not miraculously would be the wrong word to use, but you know what I mean, before the incident happened in 2007. He was also revealed to have brain disease, so that led to the banning of chair shots years later. WWE, again, they're all over the place here. They became a publicly traded company in 2000, or not 01, but like in the late 90s. They doubled their revenue in 1999 alone. Vince ended up buying WCW, his main competition, in 2001. From there, he wanted a more sponsor-friendly product to sell toys and, appeal to sponsors, stuff like that. In doing that, in developing a PG product, and it wasn't just the PG rating, it was the product itself that really cooled off, among other things. The ratings went down, but he was making more money. I think it was Bruce Hart, one of the other Harts, was criticizing the current WWE style. It's soft, which, that's probably reason number 76 if we're ranking them here as far as why WWE has died down in the last 20 years. Certainly was not the fucking style in the ring, I'll tell you that much. But anyway, that was kind of a stupid thing to include. Alvarez and Russo say the show became unwatchable, which it did, at least for Raw, for a very long time. Allegations came out about Vince in 2002, earlier this year, and that he paid hush money out to a lot of the people that were affected by his actions. He showed up on SmackDown the day the news broke, and nothing really happened. He just went out there and said, WWE, then now, together forever, and that was it. It was very fucking pointless. It was just a ratings grab, if nothing else. And, he admit that he doesn't, what the commentators here say is that he never came out and said that this stuff did not happen. He never admitted the stories were wrong. And the one thing about Vince over the years is that if something did not happen, he would come out and be very upset and say, this stuff did not happen. He never denied it. They talk about how Vince and his wife Linda had been separated for such a long time. Russo said that he had heard about it all the way back in 2012. I wouldn't really fucking trust whatever Vince Russo has to say, but that's what he said. He then had to retire from WWE per quote-unquote his choice, is what was said elsewhere at the time, although he was kind of pressured to step down, as he should have. And from that, the shows improved, the stock improved. Meltzer says that Vince, his overall legacy is that he really wanted to succeed in not just wrestling, but in everything, in boxing, and football and bodybuilding, but he failed everywhere but wrestling. He failed at every other venture except what he was doing with wrestling. And his legacy is that he was a guy with a lot of money, Brian Alvarez says, who thought he was above it all, but he wasn't. So that was the documentary, The 9 Lives of Vince McMahon. It was an interesting watch, but again, like I said, which I assume you probably have if you're listening to this review, if you have checked out the other episodes of Dark Side of the Ring, the entire 3 seasons, do not watch this documentary. You're kind of wasting your time. 90% of it, like I said, was the clips from the Dark Side stuff. We got new footage about some of the allegations. That was really what this documentary should have been about. I understand wanting to do a documentary about his life, which would go on for a lot more than 2 hours, if we're being honest, if we're going in detail with the shit that Vince has been accused of. I would have loved to have heard about Vince not liking when people sneeze and shit more than a lot of the other shit that was discussed here, because we've heard it all before. The fucking inclusion of the Montreal Screwjob, for example. I know it led to him becoming an on-air character, but to go into great detail about that again was a complete waste of time. We've heard about it a million times. This kind of feels like its own thing. Again, you show this to someone who would not watch Dark Side of the Ring, who doesn't know a lot about Vince, that's interested in wrestling, that would find it interesting, but hasn't seen the other stuff. I think this documentary is meant for those people. Otherwise, you're wasting your fucking time. But it was fine. Otherwise, it was just, I kind of figured it would be a letdown, because the China one I thought was good. It was depressing as fuck, but it was good. I think Vice really thrives with the Dark Side of the Ring stuff. Tales from the Territories, As I said when the show wrapped up a week or two ago, Was a fun show. It was far from must-see. Their bread and butter with the wrestling stuff is still Dark Side of the Ring. They're trying to get too cute with these other documentaries and other shows. Just stick to what got you guys fame on the wrestling side in the first place. Stick with Dark Side of the Ring. We'll see how Season 4 shakes out. I think they're filming it right now. But anyway, as far as the 9 Lives of Vince McMahon go, I wouldn't even really bother checking it out. If you know anything about Vince or already know or have watched Dark Side of the Ring before, because they cover a lot of those episodes, stuff that I forgot to mention earlier, like, again, Montreal Screwjob and the steroid stuff, among many, many other episodes, like the Benoit thing, Owen Hart, among many other episodes. So, again, not a ton of new content here. We don't hear from anyone in WWE currently. We don't hear from Vince himself, which was never going to happen, but, again, I appreciate the attempt. So, with all that being said, this was a miss for me. But I appreciate you guys checking out my review of said documentary. It means a lot, so be sure to like the video, drop a comment, share the video, and subscribe to the channel for more daily content. Be sure to check out, which I mentioned earlier, all my reviews of Tales from the Territories here on the channel and Dark Side of the Ring in the playlist tab. If you haven't already watched those, please do so. Have a great one, guys. I'm Graham G. Matthews, and I'll catch your ass down the road.